By the time the ancient Egyptians laid the first stone of the Great Pyramid, Göbekli Tepe was already older than the entire span of recorded human history. Consider the scale of that. Take the distance in time between the internet and ancient Rome, roughly 2,000 years. Triple it. You are only just arriving at the moment this site was abandoned. Not built. Abandoned. Göbekli Tepe, a hilltop complex in what is now southeastern Turkey, was carved, erected, and deliberately buried by human hands 11,600 years ago. Pre-pottery, Neolithic. Before agriculture. Before metal. Before the wheel. Every textbook said a site like this could not exist at that moment in history. The ground said otherwise. Subscribe right now. The next 20 minutes will connect dots you didn't know existed. You'll rewatch this. Don't miss what's coming. Every generation rewrites what it thinks it knows about the beginning of civilization. But Göbekli Tepe does not simply revise the timeline, it inverts it. The standard model of human development said complex society required agriculture first. Surplus food, settled populations, then architecture, then ritual. This site appeared before any of those conditions existed. For 50 years it sat unrecognized, catalogued as a medieval cemetery, until a German archaeologist looked at the shape of the hill in 1994 that something was fundamentally wrong with everything the field had assumed. By the end of this video, you will know who built Göbekli Tepe, what ancient DNA reveals about their origins, why the lost civilization theories collapse under the weight of the actual evidence, and why Klaus Schmidt believed this place may have triggered the Neolithic revolution itself. We will move through 3 layers of proof: the archaeological record on the ground, the tools left behind, and the genetics of the people who made them. The real story is more extraordinary than any alternative theory. The first piece of evidence arrives now. Göbekli Tepe was already 6,000 years old when the ancient Egyptians quarried the first stone for the Great Pyramid, and it had been abandoned for 2,000 years before that. Construction even began. That is not a theory. That is what the radiometric dating of organic material from the site confirms, placing its active construction phase between approximately 9,600 and 8,000 BC. The site sits on the highest point of a mountain ridge in the Taurus foothills, near the city of Şanlıurfa in southeastern Turkey, overlooking what was once the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. From that hilltop, a person standing there today sees the same landscape the builders saw. Limestone plains stretching toward the horizon, dry and wind. Beneath the surface, across roughly 22 acres, there are at least 20 circular stone enclosures still waiting to be fully excavated. Only a fraction has been uncovered. What has been uncovered is difficult to absorb at human scale. The T-shaped limestone pillars, the signature feature of the site, stand up to 18 feet tall and weigh between 10 and 20 tons each. 10 to 20 tons. That is the weight of 2 to 4 adult African elephants lifted from a quarry shaped with stone tools, and set upright with precision on a hilltop by people who left no written record of how they did it. The pillars are not blank. They are carved with images: foxes, snakes, cranes, vultures, aurochs, scorpions. Some bear abstract symbols whose meaning has not been resolved. The craftsmanship is not primitive. It is deliberate, confident, and consistent across multiple enclosures spanning centuries of construction. This is not the work of people who were learning a new skill. This is the work of people who had already mastered a tradition and were refining it. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who led excavations at the site from 1994 until his death in 2014, was unambiguous in his assessment. Göbekli Tepe was a sanctuary, a ritual center, a place of organized communal purpose, not a settlement, not a residence. The nearest water source is 5 kilometers away. No one lived on that hilltop. They came to it, built on it, and left. And then, approximately 8,000 years ago, they buried it. Who deliberately buries a temple? Not to eat, to preserve it. The enclosures were filled with clean soil and rubble in a sequence that archaeologists describe as careful and intentional, not hurried. The site was sealed. And that act of preservation, unusual as it seems, is part of what makes the evidence inside so intact. The question the burial raises is larger than the burial itself. If this site existed before agriculture, before pottery, before any of the preconditions civilization was supposed to require, what does that tell us about the actual order in which human beings developed? The standard answer is about to get significantly more complicated. The people who built Göbekli Tepe had no metal tools, no wheels, no written language, no agricultural surplus to feed a workforce, and yet they transported and erected stone columns that way as much as a loaded school bus. That sentence deserves a moment. The pre-pottery Neolithic period. The label archaeology assigns to this moment in time is defined precisely by its absences. No fired clay vessels, no domesticated crops in the early layers, no evidence of the organized food storage that the standard developmental model said had to precede any large-scale construction project. The model was built on a logic that seemed unassailable. You cannot organize hundreds of workers without feeding them. You cannot feed them without agriculture. Therefore, agriculture came first. Göbekli Tepe existed before agriculture. The model was wrong. Stop and translate that into physical reality. To build even the smallest enclosure at this site required dozens of people working in coordination, quarrying stone, shaping it, transporting it across terrain with no wheeled vehicles, raising it into position. That requires planning, communication, leadership, and the sustained provision of food and water. All of it had to be organized before a single pillar was raised, and the food supply that made it possible was not domesticated grain. It was hunted gazelle, wild cattle, and gathered plant material. The bones tell us this in numbers that are not ambiguous. Archaeological analysis of the faunal remains at Tepe found that the overwhelming majority belonged to wild species. Gazelle alone accounted for more than 60% of the identifiable remains in some assemblages. These were not farmers provisioning a construction crew. These were hunter-gatherers who had organized themselves around a shared purpose that was not economic. It was something else. What was it? Schmidt's answer, and the one that has gained the most traction in the field, was ritual. The enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were not warehouses or administrative buildings. They were places of ceremony. The carved pillars, with their animal imagery, their abstract symbols, their paired arrangement at the center of each circular enclosure, slightly larger than the rest, suggest a cosmology, a structured understanding of the world expressed in stone. Not a village, a cathedral, built before the village existed. This is the inversion Schmidt spent 20 years trying to communicate to a discipline built on the opposite assumption. The conventional sequence was agriculture, then settlement, then surplus, then social organization, 10 monument. Göbekli Tepe proposes the reverse: ritual first, then social organization, then monument, and then, perhaps, agriculture. Because once you have organized people around a ceremonial center, you need to feed them year-round. And that pressure becomes the engine of domestication. The botanical evidence from the surrounding region adds weight to this. Within 50 kilometers of Göbekli Tepe lie the wild progenitors of einkorn wheat, emergit, barley, lentos, and several other founder crops of the Neolithic Revolution. The genetic bottleneck in einkorn wheat domestication has been traced to this exact region in this exact time window. The proximity is not coincidental, but if the builders were local hunter-gatherers organized around ritual, who exactly were they? And is there any direct genetic evidence connecting those people to anyone alive today? The answer to that question is where the fringe theories go to die. Among the carved limestone pillars at Göbekli Tepe, archaeologists found something the fringe theories never mention: the broken, discarded remnants of hundreds of thousands of animal bones, butchering debris, and the grinding tools of people who lived, worked, and ate at this site across generations. The fringe theories are worth stating clearly, because dismissing them without engaging them is its own kind of intellectual dishonesty. The popular versions hold that Göbekli Tepe was built by a vanished advanced civilization, Atlantean, Anunnaki, or otherwise, whose technology has since disappeared from the record, a variation holds that extraterrestrial assistance accounts for the scale of the construction. Both share a common premise, that the people of 11,000 years ago were incapable of building this without outside help. The ground evidence dismantles this with a particular kind of quiet efficiency. Archaeologists at the site have recovered thousands of flint and obsidian tool scrapers, blades, projectile points, in stages of manufacture that show the entire production process happening in place. The quarry from which the pillars were cut is less than a quarter mile from the site, and an unfinished pillar, larger than any erected pillar yet found, estimated at roughly 50 feet in length, was left in the rock face when the quarrying stopped. That unfinished pillar is still there, 50 feet of intended stone column, abandoned mid-cut, with the tool marks of a human hand still visible in the limestone. No alien logistics, no advanced machinery. Evidence of a very large, very human project that stopped. Techa. Neoperatoire desequential. Learned skill chain visible in stone tool production is fully present at Göbekli Tepe. Each stage of the manufacturing process is identifiable, each technique traceable to regional Neolithic traditions. Each refinement suggesting not a sudden appearance of skill but a long accumulation of it across generations. This is what centuries of practiced craft looks like. It looks exactly like what was found. The fringe argument that the builders should not have been able to do this rests on an underestimation of human cognitive capacity. That is, in the end, more condescending toward these people than anything mainstream archaeology has ever produced. The irony is precise. The theories designed to honor the mystery of Göbekli Tepe end up diminishing the people who actually built it. What the evidence confirms is a population of indigenous hunter-gatherers with deep generational roots in the landscape, sophisticated knowledge of local stone and animal behavior, and a social structure capable of sustained collective labor organized around non-economic purpose. That is not a lesser achievement than alien engineering. It is a greater one. And then came the DNA. Ancient genetic analysis of pre-pottery Anatolian skeletal remains the same population cluster that built and used Göbekli Tepe found no genetic signature of any outside population migrating into the region at the time of construction. The builders did not arrive from elsewhere. They did not receive visitors who reshaped their culture. They were there. They had been there for thousands of years. And their descendants went on to do something that changed the entire planet. But the most unsettling part is still ahead, because what that DNA reveals about who is alive today reframes this entire story in a way that is deeply personal. The ancient DNA extracted from pre-pottery, Neolithic, Anatolian remains tells a story with no asterisks. The people who built Göbekli Tepe descended from local hunter-gatherer populations who had lived in that region for thousands of years before the first stone was raised. The genetic studies conducted by research teams, including those associated with the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology and published in journals including Nature and Science, show a population that was largely continuous and isolated. No significant influx of outside genetic material. No population replacement. The Anatolian Neolithic people were indigenous to their landscape. Their genetic signature was distinct from contemporary European hunter-gatherers, from African populations, and from the peoples of the Zagros Mountains to the east. They were, in the genetic record, exactly who the archaeological evidence said they were, a people of that specific place and time. But here is where the story becomes personal. If you are of European descent, if your ancestry traces back to France, Germany, Spain, the British Isles, Scandinavia, or Italy, a significant portion of your genome descends from these Anatolian farmers, not metaphorically, genetically. The migration of Anatolian Neolithic people into Europe, beginning around 6,500 BCE, is one of the most consequential demographic events in the history of the continent. They brought agriculture with them. They brought their domesticated animals, and they brought their DNA. Studies estimate that in many modern European populations, Anatolian Neolithic ancestry accounts for between 40 and 60% of the total genetic heritage. The builders of Göbekli Tepe are, in a measurable and traceable sense, the ancestors of a substantial portion of the people who will watch this video, and Klaus Schmidt's central inversion that organized ritual drove the birth of agriculture rather than following from it, now has both genetic and botanical support. The population that built Göbekli Tepe was the same population from whose territory the founder crops of Western civilization emerged. The domestication of einkorn wheat, traceable by its genetic bottleneck to the Karakotic Mountains visible from that hilltop, coincides in time and place with the active use of the site. Schmidt's hypothesis was that the ritual demands of Göbekli Tepe, feeding the gut, provisioning the labor, sustaining the community across seasons, created the selective pressure that turned wild grain into a crop, the temple before the field. The evidence does not prove this conclusively, but it is consistent with it in a way no competing hypothesis fully accounts for. What it does prove, beyond any reasonable dispute, is that human beings, 11,600 years ago, were capable of organized, sustained, architecturally sophisticated collective endeavor without the conditions the textbooks said they needed, with tools of stone and bone, and with descendants who are, in all likelihood, watching them right now. What Göbekli Tepe reveals, when all the layers are set against each other, is not simply that the timeline of civilization was wrong. It is that the model of what drives civilization was wrong. The developmental sequence that organized a century of archaeological thinking, subsistence first, then surplus, then complexity, then meaning, placed meaning at the end of the chain. Ritual, religion, cosmology. These were understood as the products of civilization, not its causes. Göbekli Tepe inverts that sequence with physical evidence. The meaning came first. The organization around shared symbolic purpose preceded the agriculture that would eventually sustain it. Human beings apparently did not build temples because they had food to spare. They may have grown food because they needed to sustain the temples. This reaches beyond archaeology. Consider what that means. The capacity for abstract symbolic thought, for cosmology, for ritual, for the organization of labor around ideas rather than around immediate physical necessity, was not a late development in human cognitive evolution. It was present in full force at the very beginning of the Neolithic record. The people who cut those pillars had minds neurologically indistinguishable from ours, the same prefrontal cortex, the same capacity for language, for planning, for metaphor, for the construction of shared meaning. What they lacked was not intelligence, it was accumulated knowledge. The 10,000 years of trial, error, observation, and transmission that separates a stone blade from a particle accelerator. The ancient DNA evidence reinforces this without ambiguity. The genetic continuity of the Anatolian Neolithic population through the construction phases of Göbekli Tepe, and then forward into the demographic expansion that seeded European agriculture, means we are not looking at a mystery population. We are looking at a founding population, one whose cognitive and cultural innovations, made with stone tools on a limestone hilltop, propagated across an entire continent and persist, measurably, in the human genome today. The fringe theories ask us to believe that the achievement at Göbekli Tepe required an explanation from outside humanity. The actual evidence asks something more difficult, to accept that it came entirely from within. That 11,000 years ago, people who hunted gazelle and shaped stone by hand looked at a landscape and decided to carve something permanent into it. Not for survival, for meaning, and that decision may have started everything that followed. That is not a lesser story. That is the larger one. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who were genetically and cognitively identical to us, indigenous to the land where they built it, organized not by economic necessity but by something harder to quantify and more enduring than any surplus. It is possible that the act of building it, the social machinery it required, the mouths it needed to feed across seasons, is what triggered the Neolithic Revolution, a temple that may have grown a civilization. What that reveals about us is this: the hunger for meaning preceded the hunger for grain. The most fundamental human drive is not survival. It is the need to organize the world into something that makes sense, and to mark that understanding in stone for people who have not yet been born. Picture that hilltop at night, 11,600 years ago. No city lights on the horizon, a fire inside one of the enclosures, casting shadows across carved limestone. 100 people who had walked days to be there, gathered around something they had made with their own hands, not because they had to, but because they needed to. That moment did not feel like the origin of civilization. It felt like a Thursday evening among people who understood each other. Eat steel doors. The most advanced thing at Göbekli Tepe was always the mind behind it. The next mystery is already waiting. Subscribe now and be there when we open it.